1968 Gun Control Act, GCA. The Gun Control Act of 1968, GCA, fundamentally reshaped federal gun laws in the United States. While the 1934 National Firearms Act, NFA, introduced significant restrictions on specific weapons, the GCA broadened the scope and introduced regulations that continue to shape the gun control landscape. Much of the federal legislation that followed, including the Hughes Amendment in the Brady Bill, built on the foundation laid by the GCA. After the passage of the NFA, federal gun laws were relatively quiet throughout the 1940s. The 1950s saw only minor updates to the Federal Firearms Act, FFA, of 1938. However, the 1960s brought a renewed push for more stringent gun control, culminating in the sweeping GCA of 1968. This decade was marked by assassinations, civil unrest, and growing concerns over violent crime, which set the stage for further restrictions on firearms. The role of imports in the gun industry. One of the key drivers of the GCA was the increasing number of imported firearms flooding the U.S. market. In the late 1950s, domestic firearm production was facing stiff competition from foreign imports. For instance, in 1955, the U.S. imported around 15,000 rifles, but by 1958, that number had surged to 200,000. This led Senator John F. Kennedy to propose a ban on surplus rifles in 1958. Despite being a member of the NRA, Kennedy's proposal was likely influenced by his home state of Massachusetts, where major firearm manufacturers such as Smith & Wesson, Springfield Armory, and Savage Arms were based. By 1968, over 1 million handguns were being imported annually, creating pressure on domestic manufacturers. This economic competition from imports played a significant role in the gun control debate, alongside concerns about public safety. Senator Thomas Dodd, the architect of the GCA. If Attorney General Homer Cummings is considered the godfather of gun control, Senator Thomas Dodd of Connecticut can be seen as the godson. Dodd, a former FBI agent and assistant to Cummings, was a key figure in the push for the GCA. His personal history, however, raises questions about his motivations. Dodd had a history of using his political power for personal gain, as seen when he successfully lobbied for $15 million in aid to Guatemala, while simultaneously being paid $50,000 annually by the Guatemalan government for legal advice. Dodd's personal corruption culminated in his censure by the Senate in 1967 for funneling campaign funds into his personal accounts. He was one of only 6 senators to be censured in the 20th century, and he lost his re-election bid in 1970. Despite his personal failings, Dodd was a significant force in shaping modern gun control. The push for gun control. Dodd began his push for stricter gun laws in 1961, following a study on mail-order firearms conducted by his staff. He introduced several gun control bills throughout the 1960s, focusing on issues like mail-order firearms, juveniles, felons, and what he referred to as Saturday night specials, cheap imported firearms that were often linked to crime. The NRA supported many of Dodd's bills during this time, including those introduced in 1963, 1965, and 1968. However, Dodd faced significant opposition, and many of his early efforts to pass gun control legislation failed. It wasn't until the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963 that Dodd's efforts gained real momentum. Even then, his proposed bill expanding restrictions on shotguns and rifles died in the Commerce Committee. Ultimately, it took another high-profile assassination, the killing of Senator Robert F. Kennedy in 1968, for the GCA to gain traction. Passed as part of the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, the GCA was signed into law later that year by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Key provisions of the GCA. The GCA introduced several significant changes to federal gun laws. Minimum age requirements. The GCA raised the minimum age for purchasing firearms. Buyers had to be 21 years old to purchase handguns and 18 years old for rifles. Increased licensing fees. The GCA raised fees for firearm dealers and manufacturers. The goal was to reduce the number of licensed dealers, making it easier for the government to regulate the remaining ones. Interstate sales restrictions. The GCA prohibited interstate sales of firearms, except among licensed dealers. This made it illegal for private citizens to sell or transfer firearms across state lines without going through a licensed dealer. Prohibited persons. The GCA expanded the categories of people who were prohibited from purchasing or owning firearms. These included felons, fugitives, minors, and individuals under indictment for a felony. Destructive devices. The GCA introduced new restrictions on destructive devices, defined as firearms with a bore over 1.5 inches in diameter. This provision essentially banned the sale of anything over .50 caliber. Serial number requirements. Manufacturers and importers were required to stamp a serial number on the receiver of every firearm, making it easier to trace firearms used in crimes. Sporting purposes. The GCA restricted the importation of firearms that were not deemed suitable for sporting purposes. This provision was used to ban the importation of many military-style surplus firearms. The slippery slope of gun control. As with the NFA of 1934, the GCA of 1968 set the stage for further gun control measures. Provisions that may have seemed minor or incremental at the time were later expanded and built upon by subsequent legislation. The notion of just one more law has been a recurring theme in the gun control debate, with each new law often leading to further restrictions down the road. In retrospect, the hearings and debates surrounding the NFA and GCA provide a roadmap for understanding the evolution of gun control in the United States. Many of the arguments and provisions we see today were first proposed decades ago, reinforcing the concerns of many in the pro-gun community that gun control laws are part of a gradual, ongoing process of erosion of Second Amendment rights. The ATF, Historical Background and Controversies. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, originally rooted in efforts to collect taxes on alcohol to pay war debts, has evolved into a federal agency with a central role in regulating firearms. Its history reflects a gradual expansion of power, from early tax enforcement in the 1800s to the controversial enforcement of federal firearms laws today. Early beginnings and expansion. The ATF's origins trace back to 1792, when the U.S. government sought to collect taxes on alcohol. In 1862, during the Civil War, Congress established the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, which included a small team of detectives focused on enforcing tax laws. This was the precursor to the ATF. During Prohibition in 1919, the agency expanded significantly and was renamed the Bureau of Prohibition under the Department of Justice. The ATF's involvement in firearms regulation began after the passage of the National Firearms Act of 1934 and the Gun Control Act of 1938. These laws necessitated a federal enforcement body to oversee firearms regulations, and the ATF took on this role. In 1972, the ATF became its own bureau, marking its shift from alcohol enforcement to a focus on firearms regulation, which continues today. The 1980s, entrapment and controversy. By the 1970s and 1980s, the ATF faced increasing criticism for its enforcement tactics, particularly for targeting gun collectors and law-abiding citizens, rather than focusing on criminals. A congressional subcommittee found that 75% of the ATF's gun prosecutions were aimed at individuals with no criminal intent, often entrapping them in technical violations of federal law. The agency was accused of inflating its arrest quotas by targeting easy cases rather than focusing on felons and dangerous criminals. These findings led to the passage of the Firearm Owners Protection Act, FOPA, in 1986, which sought to curb some of the ATF's overreach. However, the ATF's history of controversial operations did not end there. High-profile incidents like Ruby Ridge and Waco in the 1990s further tarnished the agency's reputation. Ruby Ridge, a case of entrapment and tragedy. The Ruby Ridge standoff in 1992 highlighted the dangers of the ATF's tactics. Randy Weaver, a former Army Green Beret, moved his family to Idaho to live a secluded homesteading lifestyle. The ATF, suspecting Weaver of being involved with the Aryan nations, used an informant to convince him to illegally shorten the barrels on 2 shotguns. When Weaver refused to become an informant for the ATF, he was arrested. Miscommunications and a series of escalating events led to a deadly standoff, during which Weaver's wife and son were killed by federal agents. The Ruby Ridge incident resulted in a civil lawsuit against the government, which paid out millions of dollars to the Weaver family and others involved. It became a symbol of federal overreach and the dangers of government power being used against ordinary citizens. Waco Siege. Escalation to disaster. The 1993 Waco Siege is another infamous example of the ATF's aggressive tactics. The Branch Davidians, a religious group led by David Koresh, were suspected of stockpiling illegal weapons. Although Koresh offered to cooperate with the ATF, the agency opted for a full-scale raid on the compound. A firefight broke out, leading to a 51-day standoff that ended in tragedy. The final assault by federal agents resulted in a fire that killed 76 men, women, and children. The Waco Siege remains a deeply controversial event, with many questioning the necessity and proportionality of the federal response. Like Ruby Ridge, it has become a symbol of government overreach and the dangers of militarized law enforcement. Recent controversies, Fast and Furious. The ATF's Operation Fast and Furious, conducted between 2006 and 2011, further damaged the agency's credibility. The operation allowed firearms to be sold to straw purchasers with the hope of tracking them to Mexican drug cartels. However, the ATF lost track of over 1,400 of the approximately 2,000 firearms involved in the operation. One of these guns was used in the murder of U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry, and over 150 Mexicans were killed or injured by the weapons. The fallout from Fast and Furious led to congressional investigations and a significant public backlash. Despite this, many documents related to the operation remain sealed, raising concerns about transparency and accountability within the agency. A bureau in need of reform. The ATF's history is marked by a series of controversial actions and questionable tactics, leading to widespread criticism from both gun rights advocates and the public. While the agency plays a central role in enforcing federal firearms laws, its history of overreach and entrapment raises serious questions about its necessity and effectiveness. The debate over the ATF's future continues, with some calling for its elimination and others advocating for significant reforms to ensure that it operates within the bounds of the Constitution and respects the rights of law-abiding citizens. Over the years, there have been numerous calls from lawmakers, gun rights advocates, and even some law enforcement officials to eliminate the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF. These calls often stem from the agency's long history of controversial tactics, allegations of overreach, and a perceived redundancy with other federal agencies. Notably, several legislators have proposed bills or voiced support for abolishing the ATF altogether. Representative Jim Sensenbrenner's ATF Elimination Act. One of the most significant legislative efforts to eliminate the ATF came from Representative Jim Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin. In 2015, Sensenbrenner introduced the ATF Elimination Act, which aimed to disband the agency and transfer its responsibilities to the FBI and DEA. Sensenbrenner argued that the ATF was a scandal-ridden, largely duplicative agency that lacks a clear mission. He highlighted the ATF's track record of controversy, including Fast and Furious, as justification for dismantling the Bureau. His proposal reflected growing frustration with the agency's operations and a belief that other federal law enforcement agencies could handle its duties more effectively. While Sensenbrenner's bill did not pass, it brought national attention to the idea of eliminating the ATF, sparking debates within Congress and among gun rights groups about the best way to handle federal firearms enforcement. Senator Ted Cruz's efforts to eliminate the ATF. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas has also been a vocal critic of the ATF. In 2015, Cruz introduced an amendment to an appropriations bill that would have defunded the ATF's ability to enforce regulations on gun dealers, effectively stripping the agency of its enforcement power. Cruz, like Sensenbrenner, argued that the ATF's scandals and overreach made it unfit to continue as a federal agency. He advocated for transferring its responsibilities to the FBI and DEA, asserting that these agencies could better manage firearms enforcement without the controversies that have plagued the ATF. Cruz's efforts reflect a broader trend among conservative lawmakers to push for reducing federal oversight of firearms and curtailing the power of federal agencies perceived as overreaching. Other legislative attempts. Other lawmakers have joined the call to eliminate the ATF over the years. In the wake of the Fast and Furious scandal, several Republican members of Congress introduced bills aimed at defunding or abolishing the ATF. In 2013, Representative Steve Stockman of Texas introduced the ATF Elimination Act, which sought to dissolve the agency entirely and distribute its responsibilities to other federal agencies. Stockman pointed to the ATF's repeated controversies, including Ruby Ridge and Waco, as evidence that the agency could not be trusted to operate responsibly. Similarly, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia introduced the Repeal the NFA Act in 2021, which, while not directly targeting the ATF for elimination, sought to dismantle the National Firearms Act, NFA, of 1934, one of the primary laws the ATF enforces. Greene's proposal reflected a broader desire among some lawmakers to limit the ATF's authority by repealing federal firearms laws that necessitate its existence. Support from gun rights groups. Gun rights groups like the National Rifle Association, NRA, and the Gun Owners of America, GOA, have also supported efforts to eliminate the ATF. The NRA has been critical of the agency's enforcement practices, particularly its role in high-profile controversies like Ruby Ridge and Waco. Although the NRA's official position has not always been to call for the outright abolition of the ATF, the organization has consistently supported efforts to reduce the agency's power and influence over firearms regulation. The GOA, a more hardline gun rights organization, has taken a stronger stance, advocating for the complete dismantling of the ATF. The GOA argues that the ATF is unconstitutional and that its very existence poses a threat to the Second Amendment rights of Americans. The organization frequently supports legislative efforts to strip the ATF of its authority and has lobbied Congress to eliminate the agency. Ongoing debate. Despite multiple attempts to disband the ATF, the agency remains intact. However, the ongoing calls for its elimination reflect a deep-seated mistrust of federal firearms enforcement and a belief among some lawmakers and activists that the ATF's responsibilities could be better handled by other agencies, or that they should not exist at all. The debate over the ATF's future is far from over. As long as the agency continues to be involved in controversial operations, and as long as federal firearms laws remain a contentious issue in American politics, the calls for its abolition will likely persist. For proponents of eliminating the ATF, the agency represents a symbol of federal overreach and a threat to the constitutional rights of law-abiding citizens. 1983. The Right to Keep and Bear Arms. Report of the Subcommittee on the Constitution. The 1983 report by the Senate Subcommittee on the Constitution exposed significant abuses and overreach by federal agencies, particularly the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, BATF, now known as ATF. This report, written in the context of the debates surrounding the Firearm Owners Protection Act, FOPA, is vital for understanding the systemic issues within federal firearms enforcement at that time. This report not only highlights the reality of federal overreach, but also provides a stern warning about the consequences of expansive government power. The repeated historical cycles of government abuse and subsequent exposure serve as a reminder that vigilance and skepticism of government authority are essential for preserving liberty. Key findings from the 1983 report. Misuse of federal firearms laws. The report highlights how the enforcement tactics enabled by federal firearms laws had become constitutionally, legally, and practically reprehensible. While the Gun Control Act of 1968, GCA, was intended to limit access to firearms by felons and other high-risk groups, its overbroad application led to federal agents focusing on law-abiding citizens and collectors instead of actual criminals. Neglect of criminal prosecution. According to the report, BATF's enforcement priorities had shifted away from pursuing felons in possession of firearms. The percentage of arrests targeting felons in possession dropped from 14% to 10%. BATF's figures also showed that over half of its gun law prosecutions involved people with no felony record, and a third of the cases involved citizens with no prior police contact. Targeting collectors. Instead of criminals, BATF agents disproportionately targeted firearm collectors and confiscated valuable collectors' items, rather than focusing on criminal street guns. The report cites the example of a $7,000 shotgun confiscated by BATF agents. This trend, according to the subcommittee, demonstrated that BATF's reforms had failed to shift its focus toward guns used in crimes. Entrapment of law-abiding citizens. One of the most egregious tactics uncovered was the entrapment of gun dealers through straw man sales. BATF agents informed dealers that it was legal for an adult to purchase a gun on behalf of a minor, but then use this information to entrap dealers and produce mass arrests. A significant case in South Carolina in 1975 led to the prosecution of 37 dealers, many of whom were driven out of business. Violation of constitutional rights. The report underscores how BATF's practices trampled on citizens' constitutional rights. The agency's actions were found to violate the Second Amendment by chilling the exercise of the right to keep and bear arms, the Fourth Amendment by conducting unreasonable searches and seizures, and the Fifth Amendment by taking property without just compensation and entrapment of citizens without due process. Empty claims of reforms. Despite claims of reform, BATF's practices did not substantively change. In fact, the agency's own data indicated that the percentage of prosecutions aimed at felons fell, while the value of guns seized rose, suggesting that the Bureau continued to target law-abiding citizens rather than criminals. Broader implications. The findings of the 1983 report demonstrate the dangers of unchecked federal power and the potential for abuse when agencies are given broad authority under expansive legislation. Despite the stated intentions of gun control laws like the GCA, enforcement often fell disproportionately on law-abiding citizens, while actual criminals were left unprosecuted. The revelations from this report were part of the driving force behind the eventual passage of the Firearm Owners Protection Act, FOPA, in 1986, which sought to address some of these abuses. The repeated exposure of government overreach and the cycle of denial followed by revelation reinforce a critical point. It can happen here. The findings serve as a reminder that governmental powers, once expanded, can be used in ways that trample on individual rights. This report is an essential historical document that underscores the need for constant vigilance and resistance against the erosion of constitutional liberties.